Savior. Written by Sparrow 9642. Chapter 9. Reassurance in Darkness. Nothing but silence followed, the teardrops from Sunset's eyes being audible upon their collision with the wooden floor. It was dead. A broken Sunset and terrified Twilight unable to catch their breath, and the world seeming to be going in slow motion. When Sunset finally managed to recollect her thoughts, her only response was anger. "Absolutely not!" she barked. I will not curse Twilight to an eternal life as a vampire. She deserves better. The same fiery aura from before had manifested yet again, her eyes and hair burning like the flames of a raging fire, and all her grandmother could do was look in wonder. She'd never seen something so intense and destructive, and fearing it could lead to a higher level of intensity, she quickly resolved to calming her granddaughter. "Calm down, Sunset," she commanded. "I only suggested it. I'm not forcing you to do it to her." Sunset snapped out of her daze of rage, quickly recoiling from her grandmother in sorrow. She hadn't meant to snap so extremely, but something just sent her over the edge beyond her control. She guessed it to be because it was in relation to her beloved, bringing her rage down and regaining her self-control. Once she came back, she buried her face in her hands, a mix of sadness over the situation at hand and disgust towards herself at her actions. So much was happening too fast for her to comprehend, and as much as moleskin was a big enough problem, now her beloved was cursed with some ancient torture method that was performed centuries ago, and the only solutions were to practically move in together or convert Twilight into one of her own. She was sick to her stomach. I'm sorry, Grandma. She apologized. I didn't mean... She was cut off by one of her grandmother's large hands, motioning her to halt. "It's okay, dear." Her grandmother spoke sympathetically. "I understand." Sunset nodded as an assurance, but her head remained hung toward the floor. I'd like to be alone for a while," she stated in a near whisper. Twilight jumped at those words, her eyes puffy and soaked from her tears. "Sunset," she attempted, sorrow in her tone. Sunset only kept her head hung low. I just need time." She spoke in the same low voice. "Time to think hard about things." She paused, shifting her head towards Twilight, nothing but sorrow and regret pasted on her face. I'm sorry, Twilight," she stated, choking through tears rising to the surface. Then she ran off in a flash of incomprehensible speed. Twilight immediately started to run after her, but was stopped by the elderly voice of Sunset's grandmother. "Let her go, dear," she said directly. "She needs this, and so do you." Twilight wasn't sure what to think about that, but she didn't object and just collapsed onto the couch, her face buried in her hands and another wave of sorrow coming over her again. "This is all my fault," she blamed. If I'd just never went with her, I'd be dead and none of this would be happening. She'd be safe and things would be normal. But no, I had to put my life in danger so she'd always have to save me when things got ugly. I should just jump off a cliff at this point. I've only caused her pain and near death. I'd be better off dead." She fell to tears, her sorrow peaking and her emotions deteriorating to nothing but hopelessness. She cried massively, up until Sunset's grandmother finally spoke out. "Nobody is to blame here, child," she stated sweetly. "You have done nothing but great things for my granddaughter, and for that reason alone, you should be proud of yourself." Twilight pulled her head from the comfort of her hands and looked towards Sunset's grandmother. The words that the elderly vampire had spoken had broken her from some of her doubt, but she was far from back to emotionally stable. She continued to listen. "You have shown my granddaughter things that most vampires wouldn't even believe true. And it's not just that vampires and humans can love one another, but that we are not so different from one another. Just like you, vampires have fears, weaknesses, and emotions alike, and aren't just bloodthirsty monsters of darkness. I have never seen my granddaughter as open to humans as she is with you, and while that is something that I am grateful for, the one thing that I am most grateful of you for is that you've given her true happiness. Never before have I seen Sunny so happy and whole in my life. She had such a rough time growing up, always being labeled an outcast, judged by the royals over her advanced abilities, and always ending up getting the short end of the deal, being used and abused over and over again. She has never had a true friend to experience life with from a different perspective, making her devoid of happiness in a cruel reality. Tell me, dear, how did she act towards you in your first meeting?" Twilight wiped her eyes, starting to feel a little better. "Well, honestly, she was very bossy and rude, acting like she owned me and could force me to do anything she said." Twilight confirmed. Sunset's grandmother chuckled. "Sounds about right. Prior to you coming into her life, she always acted high of herself, thinking she ruled the world. I think her mother's death really opened her eyes to just how vulnerable we are to death, but also sparked an undying rage for vengeance. Sunny was never one to stop and think before striking, and I believe that if you hadn't come into her life, she would have done something beyond reckless that would have most likely killed her. Coming into my granddaughter's life was probably the best thing that could have happened to her, because you helped her to change and see life more openly, as much as how reckless actions can affect your loved ones. She loves you greatly, so much that she'd put herself before you, and from what I've heard, she's protected you with unlimited devotion, which is why she acted the way she did when I suggested she convert you into one of us." Twilight winced at that, speaking up quickly. "That's one thing I wanted to talk more about," Twilight stated. Do you think Sunset would ever do that if it came to a point where she'd have no choice?" Sunset's grandmother closed her eyes, letting out a long sigh. "I don't know, child. It's a heavy choice to convert someone you love into one of our kind. The life of a vampire is one I'd not wish on any human. An eternal life is a life that comes with much to bear. Yes, you'd never have to worry about passing away and leaving your beloved, but at the same time, you'd have to witness the losses of friends, family, and bear whatever eternity has to offer until this world's end comes. It's a blessing and a curse, and for someone to curse one with a life as such is an undying burden to carry for eternity. Sunset may love you dearly, but in the end, she would be the one to decide what to do. I don't believe she would do it in the case of natural death, but in the case of being taken unnaturally and so young, she may or may not. You have your whole life to decide, but in the end, Sunset must do the deed. So please think hard before deciding to endure an eternal life, child." Twilight nodded as an answer, Sunset's grandmother smiling in return. All of this tension has made me thirsty, the elderly vampire said, getting up. Would you like some tea as well, dear? I can't imagine you going to sleep anytime soon after all of that, so may as well join me in company, right? Twilight giggled lightly. Sure, I'd be happy to join you, she assured. Very well, I'll be back soon. Sunset's grandmother replied sweetly. Should be interesting hearing stories from a human. Twilight only smiled, turning her gaze to her lap. While Sunset's grandmother prepared the tea, she just thought about everything that had just happened. While her emotions were tamed for the most part, her stress and fear hadn't faltered entirely. She was cursed with something inevitable, and the only escapes were death or becoming a vampire. The latter option made her heart race, unsure if she could even fathom the thought of eternal life, drinking blood as a meal, and never having to fear death. But, as Sunset's grandmother had stated, she had her whole life to decide on such a fate. She just exhaled a long breath of conflicted feelings as she engaged for what would be a long night of drinking tea and a roller coaster of emotional confliction. Sunset had cried for what had felt like hours, her eye sockets puffy and drained of tears to produce. All she had done was grieve at her unintentional act that had cursed Twilight for the rest of her mortal life, and while it hadn't been something she had intended, she blamed herself for it to the point of never forgiving herself. Her provided pillow was soaked with her tears and sorrow, seeming like a singular extraction of all of the emotions that had compiled upon her sanity over the past days of outrunning multiple threats of different kinds. Less to say, it wasn't relieving in the slightest, and aside from her current reasoning of being an emotional mess, she was clueless on what to do next. She didn't want to endanger her grandmother by staying in one spot for too long, and now, knowing Moleskin was somehow managing to keep up no matter how fast she drove or ran, she was at a loss. She tossed and turned in the bed, thinking and raging in her mind at the grim truth she had to accept, feeling as if she were in a whiplash, going in a non-stop circle that had no end. While she refused to accept what she had done unintentionally, somewhere in her mind, she knew she had no choice. She thought back to the best night of her life, now wanting to take it all back, but at the same time not wanting to. While it was a night of omens and dread, it was also one she'd never forget. An act of true love between two different beings that were supposed to be enemies. A mark in history that denied the laws of mortals and immortals alike. Evidence that two different kinds could be one. It was why her eyes were now golden and her bond to Twilight gave her the strength of a god. Something that hadn't occurred in centuries because of the manipulation and corruption that had been forged to prevent any potential threats from ending it all. From bringing peace, harmony, and equality between humans and vampires. She was a symbol of hope for her kind, but the cost of true love didn't come without consequence or challenges. A cost that she didn't know if she could pay, knowing how dreadful the life of a vampire was. Did she really want Twilight to endure the cost for her mistake? She rolled again, this time facing the wall of the room, her glistening gold irises glowing like beacons in the dark shadows of the room. Why me? Her voice was of sorrow and pain, as quiet as a terrified child's whisper. Why am I the one chosen to do all of this? I'm just a girl looking for a life. And here I am, caught between a romance with my kind's enemy and an enclosing war that could potentially end the world. I can't do all of this. I just want a normal life ridden of all this pain and torture. One where Twilight can live her own happy life and I don't have to put anyone in danger for the sake of my own needs. She paused briefly, curling up into a ball as if she were a child attempting to find protection in her own embrace. She was truly at her lowest point, and all she could do was just try. But now, because of me, the one I love is cursed to a life of either always being at my side, or the life of a vampire. A life I'd never wish upon anybody. Is this my punishment? For basically killing my mother and getting into business I should have just stayed out of in the first place? Another pause went by. I never wanted to get my mom killed. I just wanted to do the right thing. Is that really such a bad thing? I thought that's what we were raised to do. So why am I being cursed for doing the right things? She started to sob again, but no tears came out of her eyes, dried up from crying earlier. Those were good questions, and she had the right to ask some deity above for the answers to why she was being punished for doing the right things. She saved Twilight, kept her out of harm's way, prolonged an approaching war between mortals and immortals, and did her best to give mercy to those she had no choice but to kill in the end. Was that wrong? No, it isn't. And you shouldn't be ashamed of anything you've done, my little sonny. Sunset jumped instantly. That voice was unmistakable to her ears, and she knew it too well to even deny what she had just heard loud and clear. Mom? She stuttered with absolute emotion. There was a short pause that followed, but Sunset suddenly felt a warmth within the room, a comfort that matched that of a mother's love and touch. Yes, it's me, my dear. The soft and delicate voice comforted. I've always been with you, from the moment I left you and your father. Sunset's sobs grew wildly. While there was no physical way to embrace her mother, she knew she was there with her, and all she could do was let out all of her emotions. I'm so sorry, Mom. I never wanted you to get killed. I was just... Shh. Her mother calmed. I know, honey, and you don't have to be sorry for anything. I chose to give my life for yours, because that's a mother's duty. I swore to do all I could to protect you from harm from the moment you were born. And I did by giving you a life to live. I just feel so guilty. And now I'm stuck in something I'm not sure I can even win. What do I do, Mom? I'm just one girl. I can't do this on my own. I know you can't, but you aren't alone, Sunset. The girl you love has sworn to be by your side to the end. But I've already put her through so much. I love her, but I don't want to get her killed like you. I can't lose someone I love again. Sonny, listen to me. Love isn't just a one-person job. It takes both of the lovers to make a relationship work. And if you don't allow the girl to assist you in this fight, you're never going to win. You are letting your past consume what you need to do in order to succeed in this fight. And you have to let that grief go. All that you've done and earned was not out of luck or chance. It happened for a reason, and that specific reason is what you and your lover are destined to do. You can stop Moleskin, bring peace back to humans and our kind, and prevent history from repeating. But to do it, you must let your past go. Her mother's advice and guidance was the truth. and Sunset knew it, taking it all in with might and acceptance. She needed to stop blaming herself over the past and move on. Only then could she find an answer and defeat Moleskine with Twilight by her side in the final confrontation. "Thank you, Mom," she said with a smile. But what do I do next? I'm making no advantages against Moleskine no matter how hard I try. And there's not much I can do now that Twilight and I are sitting ducks on open roads. Do what you always do. Her mother answered simply. I must go now, but don't worry. I am always with you, watching over you and protecting you. I love you, sweetheart, and I am so proud and will always be proud of you no matter how this plays out. I love you too, Mom. Sunset finished. Then, like a wave washing over a surfer, the presence of Sunset's mother left, and all Sunset could do was smile. Once the presence was gone, Sunset returned to her initial thoughts with a higher level of confidence and assurance. Twilight was absolutely grateful that vampires knew how to cook a human breakfast as she dug into her potatoes and eggs. Her back was a little stiff from falling asleep on the couch after 2 cups of tea, but the embrace of the delicious food with her taste buds was enough to cancel out the slight aching. This was one of her best meals in days, so she made sure to take down the entire plate at good pace, Sunset's grandmother enjoying a simple cup of tea in between flipping the pages of her large novel rested in one of her bony hands. Twilight guessed it was her usual breakfast, aside from occasional hunts for a bloody feast, seeing she was still a vampire. They shared casual conversation as they enjoyed their separate breakfasts, hoping to have Sunset join them shortly after recuperating from last night's dramatic discovery. It wasn't long before the sight of fiery hair and golden yellow eyes met their company and Sunset took a seat next to her beloved on the couch. She looked like she had been through a war of emotions, her eyes looking swollen and puffy, but her demeanor said otherwise as she poured herself a cup of tea from the pot resting on the table. Are you okay, Sunset? Twilight asked worriedly. Sunset took a sip of her makeshift breakfast, then turned to Twilight with a reassuring smile. Yeah, I just had a hard time last night, but I assure you, while I may look like crap, I'm fine. Twilight smiled as an assurance, feeling all of the turmoil of last night fade away. All right, I believe you. Twilight replied, following by resting her right hand on Sunset's left cheek gently. I'm glad to see you're okay. You scared me for a minute last night. Sunset followed up with placing both of her hands gently on Twilight's shoulders, her face wearing a look of comfort. We'll figure it out, but right now, we just need to focus on what we need to do next. Sunset comforted, following with a nod from Twilight. Returning their hands to themselves, the conversation resumed. So, what do we do next? Twilight asked. Sunset let out a long sigh before speaking, her nerves starting to dance a little. This is going to sound crazy, but the next move is to just finish this. Sunset answered. Twilight jumped at the answer, expressing a look of panic and confusion. What? Twilight objected. You're saying that we just go back and fight this guy? Yes. We aren't making any progress no matter how far we go, and the threats are only consistently getting harder and harder to defeat. So we need to stop running and endangering ourselves and just fight back. It's going to happen eventually anyways, and we'll be no more prepared than we are now. As much as I'm against you fighting that bastard, I'm afraid Sunny is right. Sunset's grandmother added, I don't have the time or day to teach you proper combat against these monsters, and staying here is only going to end badly for all of us. If you wish to ever defeat the royals, you can't be afraid and must be willing to do whatever it takes." Sunset nodded in response. "Plus, we're sitting ducks on the roads anyways." Sunset reminded, "You're a wanted runaway, and that makes us prime targets on major roads, which we need to travel to get to the next town. The more we keep running, the more we endanger ourselves, and if you end up in a jail cell, I cannot protect you, and that makes you even more of an easy target." Twilight calmed, realizing that Sunset was right. Things were getting harder and harder the more they traveled, and they'd barely escaped their last challenge alive. As much as she was afraid, she knew it would eventually come to pass in time. The final confrontation. A do-or-die battle that only ended in death or victory. "You're right, Sunset. We can't keep running, and as much as the idea scares me to death, I'm with you." Twilight agreed, a smile of confidence meeting her lips. Sunset smiled in return, taking Twilight into a hug. They hugged for what felt like a long time, up until the elderly vampire across from them broke the moment. "As much as I wish you didn't have to do this, I wish both of you the best luck and give you my blessing in hopes of making it out alive." Sunset and Twilight broke the hug and turned to the elder, Sunset speaking one last thing before prepping to leave. "Any last advice?" she asked. "Kick his royal ass." Sunset's grandmother spoke with a wide smile. Chapter 10. Finale. The forest was dark and intimidating, Sunset and Twilight arriving in the place that Sunset called her home. She wasn't sure if she could call it home anymore after all she'd been through with Twilight, as much as the fact that she was now seen as a traitor to her kind by the royals she absolutely despised. Before their arrival, the two had made some stops to ensure that they were properly prepared for what would be a climax for the ages. They had stocked up on some extra garlic spray, and Sunset had given Twilight as best training as she could in a limited time frame to defend against a vampire, teaching her mainly how to keep her senses wide open every second of combat, shall it resort to her having to fight. Sunset had also crafted some makeshift armor for Twilight in similarity to a bulletproof vest, its purpose being to soften any blows taken and lowering the chance of dying in one strike. She had tested it to be absolutely sure it was effective, and while Twilight had winced at the contact of Sunset's hits, it had absorbed the hit enough to work as effective armor. Sunset had made the decision to only use the garlic spray, seeing her body was built differently than Twilight's and could take the hits just like a human can take another human's punch. She knew that blows would be exchanged in this battle. Sunset and Moleskin were nearly equals in strength, Moleskin having only just a slight advantage over Sunset. However, while that had been true in their last battle, years had long since passed and Sunset's strength had grown massively, her recent transformation being enough confirmation to prove it. It wasn't to say that the latter wasn't the same case though, his guidance and training being under the most powerful vampires in existence. The truth was that Sunset had no clue if she could beat Moleskin, meaning she was going into this with an intent to either beat Moleskin or die trying. It was truly potentially her last battle. Folding up her wings and placing Twilight safely on the ground, she took in a long breath and let it out slowly, calming her dancing nerves. Turning to Twilight, she eyed her with a look of care and encouragement. "I just want you to know that no matter what happens, I will always love you." Sunset confessed. "You are the best thing that has ever happened to me. and all that has led up to this moment, I did it all for you." Twilight smiled, pressing her lips to Sunset's in an embrace that spoke true love. They shared the kiss for a long minute that felt like an eternity to them in the darkness of the forest. Then pulling away, the same smile still on her face, Twilight responded, "I know you did, and I want you to know that, while bumpy at first, every second with you has been memories I'll cherish forever. Even beyond death, shall I die tonight." She paused briefly, placing a hand on Sunset's left cheek. "I'll always love you too, and no matter what, I'll find you in death." They shared another kiss, this one shorter, but no less sweet as the first one. Turning back to the dark maw of trees and foliage, they took each other's hand and marched forth into the shadowy mass. Sunset led the way, knowing the area like the back of her hand, even in thick wood that blocked out the pale light of the moon high in the sky. It was eerily quiet and as dead as Sunset's non-existent heart, seeming as if there was a lingering presence waiting and watching their every move as they walked deeper into the forest. Sunset couldn't sense or hear anything within their vicinity, so she guessed, as much as Twilight, that it was mainly the atmosphere of the forest mixed with their fear that was causing the uneasiness with every step they took deeper into the maw of darkness that was Sunset's home. To help her loosen the tension on her nerves, Sunset expressed a look to Twilight that gave assurance that she was just as scared and paranoid as she was. Showing vulnerability was one of the best ways to assure someone that they were not alone in their state of fear. It acts as a form of support, and from Twilight's reaction of walking more steadily, Sunset could tell her attempt had worked wonders for Twilight's dancing nerves. The relief didn't last long, though, Sunset jumping to attention like a focused animal being alerted of danger upon a sudden voice grazing her ears like a poisonous hiss. "Come to me, Sunset." It was pure and lethal venom to her eardrums. She knew the voice, and she also knew that meant that the eerie calm was about to escalate into an intense quell that would quake the forest out of its peaceful slumber. She gripped Twilight's hand tighter, turning to her violet irises with a face that only spoke exactly what Twilight assumed after their sudden stop. "It's time, Twilight," Sunset said assuredly. "He's waiting for us a few miles west." "Is he alone?" Twilight questioned. "I'm not sure. Most likely not, but for some reason, he seemed more civil than usual." Twilight lifted an eyebrow instantly. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean that it seems like he's willing to negotiate. I don't know what for, but knowing him, it's nothing more than a trick to give us a false sense of security." She paused briefly, her hand squeezing Twilight's harder upon her response. "Listen to me, Twilight, and listen good. Do not listen to words they speak or propose. If they offer anything to you, deny it. They will attempt to use manipulation to persuade you, and if they do, no matter what, promise me that you'll fight to not fall under their influence." Twilight gripped Sunset's cold hand tighter in response, knowing what was to come next was going to be the most challenging thing she'd ever done in her life. It scared her without a doubt, but Sunset's presence made it bearable to face Moleskin at long last. It calmed her, gave her courage and bravery unlike anything. She wasn't the same Twilight as when this all began all those days prior. She was dependent, strong, brave, and reborn as a whole new being in a world she thought never existed. But she was here and experiencing it with every passing second. She was ready to fight for her life as much as her beloved's. "I'm not going anywhere," Twilight assured with a smile, causing Sunset to express her own in return. Sunset let go of Twilight's hand and motioned her to hop into her hands. "Let's do this," Sunset finalized, following with Twilight settling herself into Sunset's arms. A single flash of trees and the sound of a rampaging creature navigating over the foliage at the speed of a rocket followed, and just as fast as it all began, it left even faster, Sunset releasing Twilight from the safety of her arms and gripping her hand tightly once more. Moleskin was nowhere to be found. Only the usual sight that the entire forest gave no matter where you stepped met Twilight and Sunset in their new destination. Sunset wasn't stupid, though. Her senses able to hear him lurking just above them in a nearby tree, to which she called him out. "I can hear you loud and clear, Moleskin. Come out and face us." A brief silence of nothing but the forest's natural ambience followed, but was quickly purged with the venom of Moleskin's voice. "I forgot about those senses of yours, but don't worry. I have no intention of keeping myself in the shadows, Shimmer." His voice seemed to be coming from all around them, but Sunset's senses said otherwise as a pair of shadows finally began to shift, revealing the vampire lord that had been pursuing her and Twilight for the past days. He stood like a monolith in the faint glow of the moonlight, seeming to tower over the forest like a beast of immeasurable height and strength, but Sunset and Twilight stood strong in his presence, unmoved or shaken. His fangs glistened like stainless steel in the night, and his eyes of crimson burned like ancient embers in the reflection of Twilight and Sunset's own irises. It was an intimidating sight, but Sunset and Twilight gave him no fear or sign of weakness. "I've got to be honest with you, Shimmer. I didn't expect this to be the way that we'd meet again in the manner of violence," he stated genuinely. "You had so much potential to be great, but you decided the path of a fool. However, never would I have thought you'd be fighting me in a case of treason, defending the very kind we are enemies of. Killing my brother was one thing, but defending our very enemy? You've become nothing more than a nuisance to all of our kind." Sunset merely ignored his rant, awaiting whatever he decided to do next. The unusual persuasive tone of his voice she had heard at first had still not left her mind. "Are you done?" Sunset mocked. "I'm already fully aware of what you and the other royals think of me, but I could give a shit less about what you or they think." Twilight winced in surprise, shocked at how open and careless Sunset was acting towards Moleskin. She almost laughed at the mockery, but knew better than to piss off a vampire lord. A growl slithered from Moleskin's mouth. "You dare to mock me, peasant?" Moleskin objected. "Have you forgotten that I am the one with the advantage in our current little situation?" "No, I haven't," Sunset replied quickly. "I'm simply showing you that you have no power over me personally. While I may be a nuisance to you and your lackeys, the truth is, Moleskin, that I am and always will be a vampire, no matter what." Moleskin only chuckled in response. "You always were a stubborn little shit, and I see clearly that you are still the same as you were all those years ago. Yes, you may, by the rules of reality, be a vampire, but to me, you are disowned as one of our species. You can think what you want, but in the end, Shimmer, I know what I do have power over." His gaze shifted to Twilight, her body jumping at the sudden realization that she was being eyed by the monster. Sunset caught on and objected instantly. "Don't even think about it." Moleskin chuckled again. "I'm glad we're on the same page. My resources tell me you two have become more than just acquaintances in our little game of cat and mouse. and I find that very intriguing." His words spoke venom and intimidation, to which Sunset responded to in her calmest demeanor possible. "That's none of your business." "It's all of my business, Shimmer. You brought this on yourself by taking the initiative to protect and defend this scum. All that has correlated in the past days is all my business, and it's your fault it turned out this way." Sunset couldn't respond, knowing Moleskin was partially correct on certain parts of his claims. Part of this was her fault, but now wasn't the time to let her guards down, so she shook off the hurt and returned to focusing intensely on the situation at hand. "Now that we are clear on who is in control here, back to business." Moleskin confirmed, a smirk meeting his cold lips. "Over these long days, I've come to realize something that I was completely foolish to have misinterpreted. I've had time to realize that this human is really not even a factor in our little game, and that she was only a pawn caught in the middle of a vampiric crime. Therefore, I have no interest in her anymore, not even as a meal." Sunset's eyes went wide. She wasn't sure if she'd just heard that correctly, given she knew Moleskin well and knew he wasn't one to just give up something like a human meal so easily. He's lying. She debunked in her mind, returning her focus to Moleskin. "No. The only one I should have targeted from the start of our little ruse was you, Shimmer." Sunset winced at the comment, knowing now that she was the main center of attention to Moleskin. She had to be absolutely alert from here forward. She had no idea where this was going. "It was you who stopped my brother from devouring this girl. You who killed him. You who stopped me from taking this weakling's life when I should have taken yours in vengeance. It was all you all along, Shimmer. And now that I've realized the real truth, I know who my real interest is. This human is nothing but a waste of dirty and tainted blood anymore." Sunset stood unopposed by Moleskin's words, knowing that eventually it would have come to this regardless. She was a trophy to Moleskin, the main prize he needed to defeat to truly become a vampire lord of the same stature as his fellow lords. She was his only obstacle from greatness, and Sunset saw that as desperation, something that could work in her favor. "Then if you want to kill me so bad, come and get me," Sunset proposed. "I've been dying for a rematch anyways, and don't plan to lose against you again." Moleskin followed with a devious chuckle that spelled out nothing good, and that's when Sunset knew that things were about to turn south fast. "While you play hastily, I think ahead. You see, I have more ways than killing you to destroy you," Moleskin stated, venom staining his tone. What are you talking about?" Sunset muttered with fear in her voice. What have you done, you bastard?" One single snap from Moleskin's fingers followed, bringing forward a sight that Sunset nearly lost her non-existent stomach at. Two of Moleskin's main lackeys held Vladimir Shimmer by his arms, dragging him into the scene in a struggle. He was in rough shape, his face cracked like glass, body weakened, and some of his limbs twisted and contorted to prevent any chance of fighting back. Sunset's eyes immediately drained tears, the sight breaking her into a state of unadulterated anger and sadness. Moleskin had crossed the line. "Dad!" she shouted in desperation. "You son of a bitch! What have you done to him?" Simply what I needed to keep him calm, Shimmer. He replied mockingly. He tried so hard to fight me, and his resistance ended him up in this shape. I even had to give him an anti-healing concoction to make him stop resisting. But don't worry, it'll wear off in time. This is low, even for you. My father had nothing to do with our current situation. Going after him is nothing but a coward's move. Oh, I think you'll find his inclusion to be very much liable, once I explain that is. Sunset growled in response. She was almost ready to lunge, but Twilight brought her back to focus with a quick tightening of her hand to Sunset's own. A reminder to not fall to where Moleskin could wipe her out in one shot. She calmed as much as possible, but her sadness did not deter as Moleskin continued to talk and hold his same mocking grin. Good girl. Now, the reason your father is included is because I have a proposition for you, Shimmer. One that can satisfy both of us and put this entire mess to rest. Sunset only continued to grit her teeth at him, but she gave him the green light to speak furthermore. You took something dear from me, so I feel it's only fair I do the same in return. Therefore, I give you 3 choices out of my sincerest generosity. You can either choose to lose your only other guardian that gave you existence, the one you love dearest outside of your own species, or take the chance of defeating me. Either way, you or the ones you love are destroyed of will, just as you destroyed mine that night. So, Shimmer, what will it be? Sunset understood now. He wasn't referring to destroying her physically, but mentally, taking away the only people she cared for and loved dearly. A fair trade. It wasn't a decision she could make. She loved both her father and Twilight too much to even contemplate putting their lives in Moleskin's to end, but refused to show Moleskin any sign of victory over her, so she gave him an answer that she could claim as her own form of victory as all of her emotions erupted to the surface. None! She lunged forward at a fast speed, letting go of Twilight in the process. Everything seemed to go in slow motion for just a moment, up until Moleskin chuckled in success at getting Sunset to do exactly what he wanted, his right fist smashing into her face and sending her flying in the opposite direction at an inhuman speed. The impact resembled the force of a massive bomb, ringing Twilight's ears as she yelled out in desperation for her beloved. It was far too late by the time she even managed to get a word out. The faint sound of distant trees being hit and falling resembling the sound of stampeding giants. Over the sounds, she managed to hear one thing though, and immediately, she knew she was in just as much danger as Sunset. Kill them. Moleskin commanded, taking off in the opposite direction to take on Sunset. Twilight wanted to object, but she knew she had her own problems to worry about, reaching for her garlic spray instantly and focusing as hard as possible to keep her eye on whoever chose to come after her. The one who held Vladimir's left arm dashed forward at her and knocked her to the ground, immediately baring their fangs at her with intent to strike her neck. Luckily, Twilight remembered her training as much as her own defensive strategies as a human after the invasion of her home. She made quick action and quickly dug her thumbs into the eye sockets of her enemy. Screams followed from the vampire, retreating from Twilight in pain. While the creature was immortal and powerful, the eyes were as fragile and vulnerable as a human's own. It was probably the only part of a vampire that was in resemblance to humans, therefore making it possible for a human to defend against one. Twilight quickly acted, standing back up and pulling out the garlic spray. Running to her enemy when she had a clear shot, she bombarded the creature relentlessly with sprays of the pungent juice. Sunset had taught her that while one spray stunned an elite, a spray for regular vampires that were not trained to fight the effects of garlic would be stunned longer. However, in the many conversations she'd had with Sunset's grandmother, She'd learned that multiple sprays can temporarily paralyze a non-trained vampire for up to an hour, depending on how much is sprayed. It had proven to be true, the barrage of sprays leaving the creature frozen in place like a statue on the ground. She knew she was incapable of killing a vampire, their skin being as tough as a block of solid concrete, so she instead aided Sunset's father in his own struggle. He'd put up a good fight, but his injuries had proven to be effective, and now he was pinned to the ground in submission to Moleskin's lackey. Twilight already knew what to do, creating a diversion so she didn't stun Sunset's father unintentionally. "Hey!" she yelled, hiding the spray bottle to catch him by surprise. The vampire assaulting Vladimir changed his attention to Twilight, their face falling to a look of shock that she was still somehow alive. "I don't know how you're still standing, but I'm quite thirsty anyway, so you'll make a great appetizer before I finish off this one," he said, preparing to pounce. Twilight just readied herself, making sure her eyes were only on the vampire and her finger on the trigger of the spray bottle. She needed to act quickly, just before he lunged and was aware of her trap, so with all focus, she waited. She watched his feet carefully, waiting until one of them was forward, and just as he took his step forward closest to her, she slinged the bottle and put pressure on the trigger like her life depended on it. While it was a little early with the spray, she opened her eyes to a vampire in a state of dizziness and confusion, meaning she'd hit her target. She didn't give him any chance to recover and just sprayed the creature down at a rapid pace, watching as the normally feared creature collapsed to the ground with a hard thud. Her training and advice had paid off, smiling in victory and rushing over to help Sunset's father up. The ancient creature that was Sunset's father gave Twilight the permission to let her help him, sitting him back up and leaning him against the trunk of a tree. Thank you, human," he complimented. Twilight focused mainly on Vladimir, looking over his wounds with care and focus. Vladimir was more focused on other things, though. "I'll be fine," he assured with a hint of pain in his voice. "You need to get my daughter and help her. She can't take Moleskin on alone." Twilight turned to him with a look of concern, sincerely worried about the condition of his wounds. "Sir, you need help. I can't just leave you like this," she stated sympathetically. My wounds are merely temporary. However, death is not. And if you really care for my family and Sunset, you'll leave me and help my daughter defeat Moleskin. I'll take care of these bastards here in the meantime." "But, sir, I don't know where they are. The force is massive and they could be anywhere." Vladimir nodded, sitting up more against the tree and moving his hands toward the base of his neck. He grabbed a golden chain around his neck and lifted it up over his head, a red crest that resembled a pristine red ruby attached to it. He handed it out to Twilight, so she took it into the palm of one of her hands, immediately noticing a red line that led from her deep into the forest. What is this?" she asked, baffled. "Just follow it, and you'll find my daughter," he advised through painful grunts. "Hurry!" Twilight only nodded, placing the necklace around her own neck, turning from Vladimir in the direction of the red line. Once she was gone, Vladimir got himself to his feet carefully and walked up to the paralyzed vampires Twilight had managed to submit with very intense focus. "Time for some payback," he stated, moving to put Moleskin's lackeys to rest in an endless limbo. Sunset had met the end of her flight in a cave, crashing through the thick, rocky wall as if it were paper thin and as fragile as glass. She'd taken some damage, but it was quickly healed in seconds as she stood up and waited for her pursuer not far behind her. Sure enough, he found her in seconds, rushing in and colliding into her with a massive force, managing to block his blows as she skidded back into the wall of the cave. The force was powerful enough to crack a good amount of her stone-solid skin, fragments of it falling to the floor along with debris off of the cave ceiling. She pushed back with her own display of power, causing the cave floor to crumble under their feet and rumble in the entire closure as if a destructive earthquake were taking place at that moment. There was absolutely no give or budge between the display, showing that the two were of equal strength. Both pushed regardless, their stubbornness and desire to outwit one another in power preventing them from stopping. Their fists clenched together, their limbs tightened to the point of nearly breaking under the pressure. Cracks began to adorn their faces from the unadulterated force. Then there was an altercation in their display. The cave floor shattered from underneath them, opening to a massive chasm with a descent of over 100 feet to another floor. Both of them fell, unable to recover from the effects of the force of their equal power. It was similar to the effect of being tagged in a fight. Not knocked out entirely, just enough to be unable to respond to any additional strikes. Upon impact with the floor of the chasm, a shattering sound like breaking glass erupted in the vicinity, both struggling to recover. They both wobbled to their feet, appearing as if they just walked out of a long night in a bar. It didn't matter to them, all they were focused on was killing one another, taking a second to catch their breath and recover. Impressive, Shimmer. Moleskine mocked in between breaths. You've definitely improved since our last fight. However, it makes no difference. You've only seen a fraction of my true power. I've simply been toying with you in the entirety of our battle. Sunset only chuckled at his mockery, fully aware that he'd been holding back the entire time. You don't think I know that? She mocked back. If you're going to kill me, then do it. No more fucking around. If this is my last battle, I want you to come at me with everything you have. Moleskine chuckled in response. Very well. If you're begging for death this badly, I will happily oblige. Suddenly, Moleskine began to change. The ground shook once again in resemblance to an earthquake as he started to shout in a way that Sunset knew meant that Moleskine had followed through with his claim. His eyes darkened to absolute black, minus his irises that glowed crimson red. His teeth sharpened into daggers, and he started to grow into a massive monstrosity that nearly couldn't fit the cave height. As he grew, two wings spread from his back, shifting into a more defined structure, unlike their originally ragged and ancient structure. His ears grew more pointy, similar to an elf's, and two horns grew from both sides of his head in similarity to a demon. It was quite an intimidating sight, and Sunset hadn't expected anything like this in the slightest, but she gave him nothing but crossed arms and a blank expression. Where's that mocking attitude now, Shimmer? He taunted in his new form. This form is only to be used in dire situations and can only be achieved by those of royal blood, so feel grateful that you get to witness something so rare. Sunset merely moved her hair from her eyes as a response in a way of saying she wasn't impressed. All I see is an oversized bigot that thinks growing over 80 feet tall makes him any more powerful than he was before. Moleskine only laughed as a response, rumbling the cave and causing small amounts of debris to fall from the walls. You'll come to regret ever challenging me at full strength, peasant. I'm going to enjoy ending your life slowly, very much. With that, he threw his first blow at Sunset, to which she dodged easily by jumping out of the way. His massive fist crushed the ground, leaving a massive indent the size of 2 of Twilight's cars. He repeated this tactic quite a few times, Sunset dodging each with nothing more than a skip or a hop. She was disappointed that this was the challenge she'd been handed, expecting something more than this, but she went with it regardless of how mediocre it was. How pathetic. She taunted. I was actually enjoying fighting your weaker form more. This is literally vampire training all over again, learning how to dodge actual threats. Why don't you land a blow to me and find out just how much of not an actual threat I am, Shimmer? He offered. Normally, Sunset would have the mind and focus to know better than to even take an offer from Moleskin, but her competitive nature and desire to kill Moleskin in his most powerful form clouded her judgment, and she lunged right at his fist currently resting on the cave floor. Her fist hit with the force of a car crashing into a building at over 200 miles per hour, intending to shatter the fist like glass. But something immediately made Sunset retort in pain, holding her hand and screaming at the sight of injection needle-sized holes at the base of each of her fingers. A burning sensation started to slither up her arm and spread throughout her body as if a serpent laced with fire were slithering through every vein in her body. Along with that, her body suddenly started to feel like it had been beaten to death by a battering ram. It was unlike anything she'd felt before, and it was severe enough to drop her like a stone. Moleskin had descended to his usual form and was walking towards Sunset with a look of absolute malevolence. What did you do to me? Sunset struggled, trying to get back up and failing miserably. Moleskin only laughed in his victory, landing a kick to Sunset's stomach in her defenseless state. I've temporarily taken your immunity to pain and healing, just as I did your pathetic waste of a father. He explained mockingly. Now, you will feel every hit and take every single one as a mortal would. But most importantly, you will not die to it, unless I rip your head from your shoulders. So that means that you'll feel the same pain I felt when you took my brother away from me. A violent kick followed those words, this time being straight to Sunset's face and off of the cave wall. How does it feel to be the very thing you swore to protect? Another horrid kick to Sunset's abdomen. The thing you betrayed your own kind for. Another kick. The thing that took my brother's life. 3 more kicks. And the best part of it all is that I get to cause you pain and torture for as long as the serum lasts. And there's absolutely nobody who can save you now. More kicks, ruthless and destructive, and all Sunset could do was take them and writhe in absolute pain. I'm sorry, Twilight. I failed. A tinge of pain struck Twilight's heart like a blow strong enough to kill someone. She had made it far, and wasn't far from the cave anymore, but the trip had been tedious and long, exhausting her and running her short of breath. Then that feeling struck her heart like a death blow, and that's when she knew that Sunset was in trouble, and she didn't even hesitate to run faster than ever before. While the foliage remained hard to navigate, she found her way through it, eventually coming to a solid wall of stone with a massive hole in it. It wasn't just a casual opening to a cave, and she knew that she'd arrived at wherever Sunset was currently. Getting closer to the opening, she could hear Moleskin's voice yelling things that she couldn't determine. but from the tone alone, she could tell he was saying them out of anger. She didn't have any plan as she climbed through the gaping entrance and looked upon the site of what clearly had been the site of some combat, dust still evident in the air from the cave's inner chasm. She quietly moved to the opening where Moleskin's voice was emanating from, glad that she'd taken her time upon seeing the descent of over 100 feet down. Now she was really at a loss. She couldn't fly or had a body made of concrete flesh and lead bones, so there was nothing she could do except watch her beloved be beaten senseless by Moleskin until he decided to kill her. Shit! What do I do now? She cussed in her mind. She searched her mind for some miraculous answer to getting down over 100 feet. But then there was another set of issues. How would she get down without being seen? And more importantly, what would she do when she did? The garlic spray trick would most likely fail against Moleskin, seeing he was of royalty and was probably trained to be unaffected by threats such as garlic. She'd perish in a single strike if she even tried entering that lower chasm. She cussed in her mind again. There was literally nothing she could do to help Sunset. Except... one solution came to her mind, the one she had dreaded from the start. But in that moment, it seems the only way to give Sunset a fighting chance in the slightest. I have no choice. She stated in her mind as she grabbed a sharp rock from the cave floor and placed it near the underside of her left arm. I'm sorry, Sunset. She dug a sharp edge into her skin and cut across her forearm, her crimson cocktail draining from the wound instantly. The scent met both Sunset and Moleskin's nostrils instantly, causing Moleskin to stop abruptly in his brutal tactics. His irises burned like a raging bonfire at the scent, his vampiric instincts taking over instantly. He eyed Sunset with deviancy. Looks like your little girlfriend has joined the party, Shimmer. He stated. No. Sunset wanted to speak more and tell Twilight to run and hide, but her body state prevented her from even doing so all she could do was struggle as Moleskin spoke the words that would seal Twilight's fate. Why don't we give her a proper greeting? I'm sure she's dying to see you. With that, Moleskin flew out of the lower chasm to the upper cave where Twilight awaited his arrival. She held a face of sternness in his presence, not giving him anything, even in her final moments. His assault happened too fast for Twilight to calculate, finding herself pinned to the ground by the monolith of a beast and awaiting the worst to come. Get off of her, you bastard! Sunset exclaimed, having found even the slightest shred of strength to get up and defend Twilight. But her attempt was shattered with merely a shove back against the cave wall, immediately submitting her and leaving Twilight defenseless. She was out of options as she felt a searing pain and pressure attack her wound, Moleskin's fangs clean in her and sucking her dry of life. In the mix of the pressure, Twilight thought back to the night she allowed Sunset to take some of her own blood, and could see that there was a difference. Sunset had been gentle and slow. Moleskin's force was beyond that of Sunset's. It felt like her entire body was being pulled by the force of 1,000 vacuums, with a stinging and burning feeling coursing throughout her body with each passing second. She knew she wouldn't survive, so she turned her gaze to Sunset as a way of saying goodbye, her eyes starting to leak tears and a smile on her face. She couldn't feel anything anymore by the time Moleskin finished, and she guessed it was something that happened before you died. Moleskin pulled his fangs from Twilight's arm and turned back to Sunset with a grin of victory on his face. And now you have nothing, Shimmer. He mocked. Just like before, you couldn't defeat me. And now, it's cost you more than just pride, but something more. Moleskin stopped, his demeanor shifting into something more defeated than victorious. He suddenly started to choke and gasp for breath in desperation, collapsing to his knees and holding his hand at the base of his throat.
What is happening to me?
He choked out. Even Sunset had no comment, watching the vampire lord falter furthermore. Only until a chuckle from Twilight met the cave did it become clear that Twilight had somehow tricked him into assured death.
You got tricked by a mortal,
she muttered out.
Your own greed led to your demise.
12 hours earlier. You're absolutely sure this'll work? Twilight asked, a small cylindrical tube being presented to her. Sunset's grandmother nodded. What lies in this is centuries of research and gatherings of multiple ancient poisons that are not known of by many. Back in the 1800s, vampires were used like lab monkeys for human remedies, and in those hundreds of years of testing, the vampires reacted very negatively to many of the test ingredients to the point of where they died on the spot. I've gathered all that caused such reactions, and I've bundled all of them into a single pill. This is the only one that exists, because many of the things that caused death died with the evolution of history, but to get the ones that still exist are nearly impossible. I am giving you this only as a last resort, shall it come to where you have no other way to keep my Sonny safe. The poisons will not affect you, only the vampire, and to make it work, you'll have to take it at least 30 minutes prior. This is the most potent thing I have, so I expect you to use it wisely and correctly. Twilight nodded and took the tube from the elderly vampire, placing it in a safe pocket of her jeans. I'll protect her no matter what it takes, Twilight assured. I promise, I won't let this go to waste. Sunset couldn't believe it. Twilight had outsmarted Moleskin by using his own greed against him, but at the cost of protecting her and losing her own life in the process. Moleskin continued to choke and beg that the impossible had just happened to him. Being beaten by a mortal was the worst way to die, and he was about to die because of that reason, and there was no stopping it. He couldn't speak or object, starting to succumb to the poisons in one devastating climax. His breathing slowed, his choking receded, and in one single collapse, Moleskin fell silent and limp in death. The battle was over, and somehow Sunset and Twilight had arisen victorious. However, the cost of victory had been one life, Twilight's life, and Sunset refused to accept it as she dragged herself desperately to Twilight's side, reaching out her hand for Twilight's own. She could already feel her emotions starting to swell, and she didn't care. She loved Twilight more than anything else, and wouldn't leave her side. As her tears began to escape, a faint but happy voice spoke. Twilight's voice.
Hey, we did it, Sunset.
Her words were like a whisper. Sunset, while in agonizing pain and her heart shattering slowly, managed to giggle in response.
No, you did it.
She spoke slowly.
Yeah, I did.
Sniffles and sobs started to escape Sunset, but she still tried to talk normally.
I'm so sorry, Twilight. I should have just held my ground. but I just... Hey, don't blame yourself, Sonny. But it's because of me that you're here. If I'd just stayed calm, we could have figured out another way.
Her sobs intensified instantly.
I was supposed to protect you, but I failed. I let you down. I let you down, and let you get killed.
A sudden warmth met Sunset's hand, Twilight's own weakly caressing the top of it. She quickly gripped it tight, the warmth not as warm as usual, but it was still warm, and still Twilight.
You did protect me, Sonny, and gave me a life that I would have never had if I'd never met you that night. You protected me so much that it was my turn to protect you for once. But your life is more important than mine. You have a life to live, things to see, people to meet. Why protect me when I'm the one that led you to this?
The grip of Twilight's hand suddenly tightened.
Because I love you, Sonny. From that day in the spring to now. And I always will.
That did it. Sunset found the strength against her body's objection to meet Twilight's lips for the last time. Tears escaping her eyes as she passionately embraced her beloved in near death. The two shared the embrace as one for a long while, up until the embrace broke from Twilight's body falling limp. Her hands gripped with Sunset's fell, and a single breath escaped Twilight's mouth in the sound of a death gasp. Twilight Sparkle, Sunset's beloved, was gone. All that followed was tears and sorrow, Sunset's emotions breaking in one whole culmination of unadulterated grief. She cried for what felt like eternity, up until she passed out on Twilight's chest stained with her tears. She didn't know when she passed out, only that she'd lost everything. And in some way, even though he was dead on the cave floor, Moleskin had won. Epilogue. A New Beginning. Sunset's eyes shot open, waking to the sight of the bedroom of her grandmother's house. Her eyes were heavy and swollen from the previous night, everything coming back to her in a sudden flash that spelled out the realization of her reality. Her beloved was dead. She didn't want to believe it, but it was true, and that's what she despised the most. Getting over her mother was hard enough, as now she had to move on without Twilight at her side. A feat she saw as impossible, but she knew it wasn't. The next thing that came to her mind was how she'd ended up back here. All she had remembered was crying endlessly until she passed out on Twilight's corpse. So who had come to retrieve her in the cave? Then she remembered her father. That had to have been the one who brought her back here, seeing he was the only person who wasn't against her and aware of their current location. Rather than debating it further, she decided to just see for herself, lifting the sheets from her body and finding her way to the door. It wasn't long before she was in the living room where her father sat in a position that spoke worry and concern, his wounds and horrid condition now gone and healed as if nothing had ever happened. She was relieved, walking up to him and making her presence fully known in the light of the room. Vladimir slowly raised his head, and without even a word, they embraced each other tightly for a long while. It was quiet the entire duration, up until they finally let go and Sunset spoke first. I have so much to explain. Vladimir cut her off instantly, a smile dressing his face. I already know everything, sweetie, he claimed. Your grandmother already told me everything. The girl, the royals, and all. Sunset let out a long sigh before speaking again. Are you mad at me? She questioned. I'll understand completely if you are. Vladimir raised an eyebrow. Mad at you? Sonny, if anything, I'm absolutely proud of you. He explained. Everything you did was out of good reason, and that's how a leader of our race should act. Unlike how Moleskine abused his power for the sake of vengeance. You also proved that what is supposedly an enemy race can be accepting to ours in all manners as well. You've proven that the royals are liars, and have shown that they can be defeated. Sunset smiled, relieved that she wasn't in trouble with her father, and more relieved that he saw her actions as acts not of defiance, but of good reason. Her smile faltered not long after, though, the truth of reality hitting her yet again. Her father noticed and spoke up. Why the long face, Sonny? It's what happened in the cave. Her father expressed a sympathetic look, putting one of his cold hands on Sunset's right shoulder. What's happened, honey? Sunset could feel tears starting to well up in her eyes as she attempted to respond, her voice starting to turn into sorrow. That girl that I was with, I... A sudden interruption broke the sorrow, the front door opening and entering her grandmother and... Twilight? Sunset nearly passed out at the sight before her eyes, unsure if she was dreaming, hallucinating, or both in tandem. She was dead in the cave. She was absolutely sure of it. Once Twilight saw the sight of Sunset in the living room, her composure broke into one of sorrow and happiness, running forward and embracing her beloved. I'm so glad you're finally awake, she exclaimed through tears, confusing Sunset even more. Sunset couldn't speak, frozen in a stunned state and unable to comprehend what was happening. Twilight pulled away and stared at Sunset with concern. What's wrong, Sonny? I thought you'd be happy to see me. Sunset's father cut in, attempting to resolve all the confusion. Perhaps it's best we tell her about what happened, he proposed. When what happened? Sunset demanded. I'm happy, but also confused on how this is even possible. Twilight, you were as dead as roadkill. So how the hell are you alive? Twilight nodded, taking a seat on the couch. Well, technically, I'm not alive, Twilight explained, opening her mouth to reveal a pair of glistening fangs stained freshly with crimson blood. Sunset gasped in horror, the realization hitting her like a ton of bricks. She didn't know how to feel, never wanting her beloved to endure this kind of life, but it was clear that the damage was already done. That bastard turned you. She trailed off, tears escaping her eyes off the end of her words. Twilight nodded as an answer, her father cutting into the conversation. When I found you and Twilight in the cave, I assumed the worst as well. However, after I collected you and started heading out of the cave, she suddenly started to show signs of life out of nowhere. Two weeks earlier. Vladimir Shimmer couldn't believe the sight before him. His daughter, emotionally exhausted and passed out on a human's torso, and a dead royal on the floor. On one end, he was relieved that he wasn't losing another loved one to a royal, but on another, he was wondering how the hell this was going to be covered up successfully. That could wait for later, though. He was exhausted and wanted to just get himself and his daughter to safety, so he proceeded to doing so, lifting his daughter from the corpse of the human girl who had saved his life, and positioning her in his arms to where he could carry her with comfort. Before turning from the sight, however, Vladimir gave his thanks and condolences to Twilight in her peaceful, eternal slumber. I'm so sorry it turned out this way, but I sincerely appreciate all that you've done for my daughter and I. Your generosity will not be forgotten, human girl. May you rest in peace, wherever you are now. Using his ancient fingers to close Twilight's eyes, he turned from the sight and moved to the exit of the cave. He was just about to cross the opening when he suddenly heard a disruption that caused him to stop in his tracks. An eruption of coughs and gasps suddenly filled the cave, to which he turned around to inspect and became shocked at the source of the disturbance. The girl who was dead as a lawn buried in snow just moments ago was coughing, moving, and showing clear signs of life. Vladimir gently lay Sunset up against the wall of the cave, then moved back to the girl. Upon one glance of the girl, he immediately knew what was happening and just how dire the situation was. Newborn vampires needed immediate attention, otherwise they'd die. The girl opened her eyes to reveal her newly gained red irises and eyed Vladimir with desperation, her voice coming out as nothing more than a weak rasp.
Please, so thirsty.
Now Vladimir had a choice to make. Let it starve and die, or feed it to health. It was a simple choice for him, given the display he'd found when he first arrived. He knew his daughter cared dearly for this girl, so he ran off to find her an animal to sink her fangs into. Sunset started to understand. While she had hoped for Twilight to not endure this life, she had to accept it. Twilight was now a vampire, immortal, part of her kind's species, and most critically, she was now her guide in this new world. Their relationship had officially become an eternal partnership, and now it was Sunset's duty to teach her everything about her world, knowing that Twilight's old world was null and void. It was a sad realization, but it was the reality of their existences, so it was best to just accept it. The venom must work slower on humans, and that's probably the reason why her transformation was delayed. Sunset guessed. Most definitely. Her grandmother chimed in. However, none of that matters now. What matters is that this girl is now your responsibility. She's your partner for eternity now, which means it's up to you to protect and help her in our world until she is fully educated and trained to survive it. I know, and I'm willing to take that responsibility with utmost sincerity. Sunset confirmed, and will hold my word to the day that our eternity ends. Sunset's grandmother nodded and smiled in response, proud of her granddaughter. Very good. Now, over the 2 weeks you were out, I've given Twilight the basics on hunting, but she still struggles with actually going through with it. She's still not fully aware of what she is, and it'll take a while for her to come to full acceptance of what she is now. I'll do my best. Sunset stated confidently, holding her gaze with Twilight's. both of their faces holding the same expression. With the potentially lingering danger and Twilight still new to her life as a vampire, Twilight had decided not to immediately return back to her home. While she missed her parents dearly, she didn't want to cause them any unintentional harm or give the royals any targets to use in their rebellion against Moleskin's defeat. Newborn vampires were subject to the inability to control their instincts, so if she went back now, there was the chance of her attacking and killing not just her parents, but also any human being within a mile's radius. Not only that, but her appearance had changed as well. How would she explain her new eye color and ice-cold skin in a way that made sense? The simple answer was that she couldn't. At least, not in her current state and age as a vampire. She'd need loads of training, experience, and control before she could ever go near her parents ever again. A truth she had come to accept. One that hurt her deeply, but she'd hate herself more if she ever killed her parents on accident. She'd return someday, but only when she was ready to go home. For now, her life was solely her guide and beloved in her rebirth, and she knew Sunset would help her to reach her goal of seeing her parents again, but only time would tell how long it would take. It was a weight Twilight dreaded to endure, but she knew it was for the best. So she did her best to just adapt to her new life and self, doing her best to embrace the long life she had left to live. With Moleskin no longer being an issue, Sunset and Twilight were free to roam as they pleased, and one area they chose to visit as a reminder of how their lives came to be as they were was the spring they had first shared their deepest personal conversation at. It was a beautiful and calm little piece of paradise they could return to and reminisce about their new life together in eternity, and do whatever they wished without anybody telling them what to do. The two sat on the shore admiring the calming natural body of water, the only sound being of the steady flow of the clear water and whatever else nature had to offer on that evening in particular. The two were dressed only in their bathing suits, dry as the Sahara Desert in a romantic embrace. Twilight had her head rested on Sunset's left shoulder, her hair pulled up in a ponytail, and her legs laid out on the shore in a relaxed state. Sunset only held herself up with her arms, the rest of her sprawled out on the shore and hair down. Her hair contrasted with the glow of the sun perfectly, seeming to glow in the radiance of the light, to which Sunset admired with her crimson eyes. They'd been sitting there like that for nearly an hour, just allowing the natural sounds and ambience of Mother Nature to caress their minds and envelop them in natural bliss. It was perfect harmony, and the two lovers had needed this after what they'd been through with Moleskin. "Hey, Sunset?" Twilight suddenly asked. Sunset replied. "Do you really believe this can last?" Twilight questioned. Sunset raised an eyebrow, sitting up more steadily on the shore, causing Twilight to lift her head from her shoulder. "What do you mean?" Sunset replied. "You know, this piece. It's been almost a month since we defeated Moleskin, and don't you think things have been too quiet for comfort?" This was the question Sunset had hoped to have never had to answer, but she knew eventually it would come up, and she had thought the same thing. She assured Twilight with a comforting smile. "Knowing how my life has gone, it's only a matter of time before something new pops up. I've thought the same, wondering why things have stayed quiet ever since that night. But at the same time, I've also just tried to enjoy the time we have been given before the day comes that we must face the royals again. As my mother once told me, you can't anticipate what may not come, otherwise you'll miss out on what's really important in life. Your mom was a very wise woman," Twilight complimented. "While I'm still trying to accept and come to full reality of what I am, I know I'll always have a piece of my human self inside me. And that piece of me will always keep me wondering what's coming next in this new life and world. Sunset pulled Twilight closer to her in a comforting embrace. I know, and I won't force you to rid yourself of something that still holds that connection to what you were born as. You'll always be human in some way, and I can accept that. That's the version of you that I fell in love with and will always see as the one I love. Your skin may be as cold as ice, your eyes may be as red as your only life support now, and your heart may no longer beat like a drum. But none of that matters. I'll always love you no matter what, my little Sparkle. Twilight's face immediately wore a blush at the compliment, her lips forming into a smile. And while you may not be as bossy as when we first met, I'll always love you as you are, Sunny. Twilight returned. Oh, so you did like my bitchiness. Sunset teased. No. I was just joking, Sunny. Twilight quickly answered. Sunset merely laughed in her victory. I know, I'm just teasing, Twi. Sunset assured. But if you do want me to act like a bitch, I'll happily oblige. No thanks. I love you just the way you are. Sunset chuckled at Twilight's cute gesture, noticing that the sun was close to going down. We should probably head back now. Sunset alerted. Yeah, that's a good idea. Twilight agreed. But before we leave, can we take one swim? Just like old times? Sunset smiled, making her way to her feet. All right, but just one. Sunset agreed, proceeding to remove her bathing suit in a teasing manner. Twilight smiled seductively at the action, doing her own strip teasing as she undid her bathing suit. Once they were done teasing one another, they raced each other into the spring and, starch naked as a newborn at birth, shared one long and romantic swim in their own personal paradise. While the future was unsure, the two knew they would find a way to overcome any obstacle in their eternity together. Royals, humans, natural disaster, death. Their love would find a way to overcome them all in eternity and beyond.